On a Tuesday, we like to connect with Greg Bondar. He's National Director of Christian Voice Australia, national think tank advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg Bondar, a special welcome back to 2020.
Delighted to be back, Neil. Thank you very much for the invitation again.
Greg, a lot of things you're doing revolve around some webinars, and you've got a growing audience now, and you have some pretty special guests. You've got a webinar that's on tonight, and it's focused on the voice. What are you particularly focusing on?
Neil, I apologise. That webinar was last night.
Oh, okay. It's last night. Okay, so we're coming in light of that. Okay, that's great.
Yeah. So you're really getting first-hand the feedback. I had as my guest Barnaby Joyce, MP, as you know, Queensland-based. I also had a senator from Tasmania, Johnathon Dillon, and along with that, I had an Indigenous person who described himself as Aboriginal and Australian, and that was Anthony Dillon. Now, it was a very, very good webinar. We were to have Warren Mundine on, Neil, but interestingly, if you saw the newspapers on the weekend, Warren was self-confessing in the media that he's been under attack because of his stance on the voice, being the no case, and he's contemplated suicide many occasions. So this was really sad, Neil, because what we're seeing now is that, are we being prevented from voicing our opinion on the voice, Neil?
When you've got this sort of intense pressure, just staying with Warren Mundine for a few moments, intense pressure, it does have an effect on mental health, and it is challenging, and it just goes to show just how divided our nation is right now around this, and the sorts of mudslinging that's going on, and even you might even say from both sides.
Oh, absolutely. Neil, the issue we have here is that the Australian public are being presented with a choice being a referendum that says that we recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution, plus other things that are not explained to us, and the other choice is to say, no, we don't want this. Now, one of the issues we've got, Neil, is that, quite frankly, I think that if we're being pressured into having to agree with a yes vote, then it's a sad case for all of us, whether you're Christian or non-Christian, whether you're Indigenous or not. So we've got to be very careful that we have a balanced biblical debate on this issue, Neil.
I guess at least, Greg, there is going to be a pamphlet delivered to every letterbox in the country, and it's already available online, and it does present a yes case and a no case. At least that is one of those things that will go out. But was there any sort of debate, or what have you heard about how effective that pamphlet might be in persuading either side?
Yeah, and look, I think the issue with the pamphlet is it can be very difficult to interpret. And also, I think you've got to be very careful on what the cases each side has put forward. The real issue that was made last night by, in particular, a number of the speakers was that, quite frankly, we're being presented with a choice that we don't have all the details on, Neil. Now, we perspective as well, Romans, when I was reading this, government is given by God as a good gift for the maintenance of justice and ordering of human society. The issue we've got here is, do I have to vote as the government tells me, yes, or can I, as a Christian, make my own choice and vote no, for example? Some Christians may want to vote yes, but the real issue here is, Neil, what is the impact on us as Christians, and in particular Australia as a whole?
Interesting, isn't it? If you try and define or work out what is happening with all of the withholding of facts around the voice, as you say, there's so much concern that the government isn't wanting to give all the detail about how this whole thing might work if there is a yes vote. There's a sense here in which coercion happens by the withholding of the truth. Is this something, do you think, that we're seeing right now that's unfolding in our society? I mean, it's quite obvious that there's a withholding going on. Is that actually a coercive thing? Is that something we should be really concerned about?
Oh, absolutely, Neil. And I think, later on in your program, now that you'll be talking about the issue of the information draft bill that's before Parliament as well, which is another instance of government trying to control what you can and can't say. But that's another issue. Last night, the point was made quite clearly, Neil, in the webinar that Australian Aborigines do not need a taxpayer-funded lobby group, The Voice, written into the heart of our constitution, Neil. That's the issue that is really at the heart of the matter. And Jacinta Price, whom you know well, who conducts the Fair Australia campaign, is making the point quite clearly for mainstream Australians to realise that The Voice is divisive, dangerous, expensive, and it's just not fair for the mums and dads of Australia.
I wonder if you've got any thoughts here, and you're very well connected, Greg, where the church is on this issue. And then, of course, when you say where the church is, that's a very generalised sort of a comment. A lot of churches and their leaders came out early on in the debate and were saying yes is the way to go. Is there any wavering? Is there a change from where churches have founded their position on this, do you think?
That's a good question, Neil, because I think there are a lot of pronouncements made by prominent churchmen and theologians who are saying, oh, look, really, we should be voting yes. But the point is made by a number of commentators, Neil, that these prominent churchmen and theologians are actually misguided on the issue. All factors considered, my view and a lot of commentators' view, Christian commentators, that Christians should be voting no to a divisive constitutional change. The church as such always says, well, we can't get involved in this issue. Well, we can. Some church spokespeople have come out publicly, but I think they've been misguided in actually understanding the implications of the voice in terms of constitutional management and in terms of also the impact it's going to have on the average mum and dad in the street, Neil.
So after last night's webinar and your conversations with your guests, I mean, I'm, maybe I'm just preempting here, but clearly there was a strong no that was coming from the guests that you featured in the webinar last night.
Absolutely. I mean, the point also was made, I guess, in a sort of a quiet way that there are far too many culture warriors out there at the moment, Neil, that, you can see them in the public service, in sport, schools, and in the workplaces. And we don't need another culture warrior being the voice to tell us what and how we should be thinking about the future of Australia. Now, the question, if somebody says to me, should Indigenous people be recognised in the Constitution? I say yes, full stop. No more. In other words, no more of the voice. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it's going to work. We don't know the implications. We don't know the regulations to it. If in doubt, Neil, the answer is no.
If in doubt, the answer is no. And I think all Australians of goodwill, all Christians of goodwill, will want to see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters recognised appropriately. But yes, there is a line by which you might say there has to be no, because we don't know the full detail. There's so much unknown, and there does appear to be a coercive stance from government around what is likely to come, and there are all sorts of scepticism, and you might be cynical, rightly, about who's going to be making those rules and setting it all up once there is a yes vote, if that were to happen. And just to mention too that there is a brand new book that has just been released. It's called The Spirit Behind the Voice, the religious dimension of the voice proposal. It's edited by Gabriel Mowens and Augusto Zimmermann, and I'm going to be having lots of conversations about those issues and the chapters that are within that particular book. And so for listeners keeping an eye out, if you're looking and saying, what is the religious dimension around the voice, that book might be one you can get a hold of. It's published by Connor Court. Hey, Greg, let's turn to another issue, something else that's another passion of yours, and that is men's ministry. And you've got a men's summit webinar coming up. What's this one all about?
Yeah, look, the actual summit is on tomorrow, Neil. It's a webinar. If anybody wants to, my website, um, and you can register. Look, Neil, just talking about Warren Mundine, adding suicide. The issue with today are under enormous pressure, and we'll be talking about what are the factors that know in order to engage with men. And I think that's going to be a real issue, because they are things like gender roles, stay-at-home dad, gender equality, dads as educators, and dads and church. So they're real topics that we need to talk about.
Interesting change that's happened over the decades. And, I know you're not ashamed to say you're old enough to remember some decades ago, but you've got this perspective and you remember men and men's ministry just going back 30 years. What sort of transitions and changes and ups and downs have you noticed along the way, if you were bringing some sort of contrast or comparison over that time? How do you think about that, Greg?
Look, I think, one of the things I want to talk about is gender roles. I mean, look, Neil, when I was growing up, I must say, mum did the housework, the cleaning, the cooking, the ironing, the wash. She did all that. And dad went and earned the income, so to speak, These days, I look at my two sons, Neil, who are both happily married, wonderful wives, wonderful children. Do you know what, Neil? And sometimes I'm ashamed because my wife always has a go at me. Look at your sons. They're washing, they're cooking, they're ironing, they do the shopping. And I said, yes, darling, I know. Don't keep reminding me, because the point I'm making is that, Neil, our roles have changed. And for the better, may I say, for the better. Because don't forget, biblically, women and men are complementary in terms of what they do.
And we pick up where there are weaknesses, and we hope that our wives pick up our own weaknesses too, and so we run with each other's strengths. The role of the church in all of this, men and this sort of gender equality ideal. What are your thoughts here, Greg? And is this sort of the things that you will be, addressing when you with your summit?
Yeah, look, I'm doing some research on this, Neil, because the role of the church in men's ministry is huge, absolutely huge, and I'm sorry to say, neglected. It's been neglected to the extent that, a lot of churches that I speak at and preach, there are no men's ministry. Men don't have a huge role within the church. In point of fact, history and an observation tells us that women tend to be more active in the church than men do. And yet, Timothy, 1 Timothy 2:8 tells us that the men in every place ought to pray, lifting up their hand without anger and arguing. In other words, men need to be active in the church. So it's a real challenge. And my question, Neil, is what is it that's stopping men from being more active in their church?
Okay, and so you're going to be addressing some of these sorts of things in your webinar, and just let us in on a thought or two that you might have. The things that are stopping men from being active in their church, and there might even be some, dragging their feet, being active in family and marriage life as well. And there's challenges that men face and challenges that women face as well. But if you're focusing on men, what are your thoughts here around the causes? And, and I guess we haven't got a lot of time to unpack this, but some of the basic things that we might be interested in taking things a little deeper in our own thinking.
Yeah, now let me refer to some research I came up across in the USA about what words describe masculinity for today's men. And interestingly, here are some words I'm just going to quickly at random give to you. Unhealthy, endangered, confused, in crisis, changing, threatened, declining, weak, regressive. And here are some other words. Healthy, thriving, vibrant, stable, unchanged, hopeful, improving, strong, and progressing. These are positive and negative words. Do you know what research shows, Neil? That Christian men invariably have chosen the negative, whilst non-Christian men have seen themselves as being far stronger than Christian men. Christian men see themselves as being challenged and changing. So there's a real issue here of perception of how Christian men see their role. And this is one of the things I'll be unpacking tomorrow.
And just a brief one here, because we've got another thing to quickly move on to. But Jesus, the ultimate role model for manhood, in all of the appropriate ways of relationship building in every dimension here. Sometimes he's not seen as the ideal manhood role model because you've got a whole lot of movie stars that try to assume that. But any thought just very quickly here on Jesus, the ultimate role model for manhood?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we should be striving with as Christian men is to be Christ-like. Christ-like in our thought, word, and deed. And it's important to realise that you don't have to have six-pack muscles and what have you. You don't have to be, handsome or whatever. It is all about being faithful to your family, to your wife, to your friends, to your colleagues. And I think that says more. But what worries me, Neil, is that Christian men don't perceive themselves to be strong. They see themselves as being challenged all the time. And there are reasons for that, which, of course, will take some time to unpack, Neil.
And we do like to champion Christian manhood and to actually show that in its reality, because there's a lot of distraction. Hey, we did mention, quickly, let's touch on the misinformation, disinformation bill. The Albanese government proposing to combat misinformation and disinformation, but it's got some ramifications. Your quick thoughts on that, Greg?
Yeah, very quickly, Neil, I think here's an opportunity for every one of your listeners to get out there and make a submission into Parliament. They just have to Google the misinformation and disinformation bill. The point I want to make here, Neil, is, and I can speak from experience here, is that if government is going to be the ultimate authority on truth, how then is we as Christians going to be able to expound our views on faith, life, family, freedom, and in particular, how we're going to do that in the public arena? Because if we're going to be shut down, and if the government is controlling the means by which we can do this, our freedoms, Neil, are really threatened. And that's the issue for me, because just recently I wrote one of the major radio stations in Sydney advocated in a way to say, euthanasia was a wonderful thing because you could now do it legally. The issue I've got here, Neil, is that we've got to stop promoting something that is unbiblical, and if you're a pro-life person, you would take great offence at that. So really, what we've got to be doing is make sure government do not control what you and I can say, Neil.
Well, of course, information is power, and the greater the power, the more dangerous the outcomes, even the abuse of that power, and thought control is nowhere we ought to be wanting to go. But that looks like where we are headed. And as you say, there are listeners who could actually have their own say, some sort of a submission to any inquiries that are being set up around what might happen with that misinformation, disinformation bill. Let me point listeners to connect with Greg Bondar. He's National Director of Christian Voice Australia. It is a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. You might want to connect with Greg. ChristianVoiceAustralia.blog. ChristianVoiceAustralia.blog. He mentioned the webinars. There's another one on tomorrow night. That one's around the manhood issue. And you might like to keep an eye out too for Greg's book. He's the editor of the book Silencing of the Lambs, Wokeism and Cancel Culture's Attack on Christianity in Australia. But that website, ChristianVoiceAustralia.blog. Greg Bondar, thanks so much for your update again today on 2020.
Thank you very, very much, Neil, for the opportunity, and God bless you.